So our speaker this morning is Dr. Danielle Bailey, who comes to us from University of Texas, where she is the Associate Professor of Criminal Justice and the Executive Director of the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning. She has an assortment of degrees herself in criminology, criminal justice, and forensic and investigative science. And she teaches an interesting array of courses, including forensic science, research methods, criminology, crime scene processing, and courtroom testimony. So I thought that was kind of a unique set of courses to offer. She's focused her research on sex offender registries and their impact on registered people, their families, and their communities. Bless your heart, girl. She has published numerous papers on these topics, as well as papers on research methods. Her most recent offering, a paper entitled Campaigning for Change, How State Level Groups Advocate for Legislative and Sexual Offense Reform, is right up our alley here. I love to capture somewhat personal notes about our speakers, and in researching Dr. Bailey's background, it was clear to me that she has a particular heart for how-tos of teaching and learning. I can imagine that this is why she has a list of teaching awards, most recently having been named a distinguished teaching professor at UT. One paper I noticed is perhaps a little off topic, but it really kind of illustrates her creativity in teaching methods. It's entitled Learning to Catch a Killer, the Advantages and Challenges of Planning a Community-Oriented Murder Mystery to improve forensic science education outreach. Hey, I'm all in. I'm a murder mystery junkie. She's here to speak to us today on building advocacy. Won't you please give a warm welcome to Dr. Danielle Bailey.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that great introduction. I actually have a slide where I introduce myself, but I think he kind of covered everything. I definitely am a little bit of an eclectic mix with, forensic science and sexual offense policy and all the fun stuff. Let me get my monitors figured out here. So just to give you kind of a background of my journey, I started working with sexual offense advocates back in 2013, actually, when I was a PhD student. I was in Nebraska, and my mentor, Dr. Lisa Sample, was working with the board of Nebraskans Unafraid at the time, and I was assigned to be her research assistant. I've never been personally impacted by the sex offender registry, but as I got to know the board and I became more involved with Nebraskans Unafraid, I really saw countless examples of how our policies that we put in place have negatively impacted families from across the country. And I became really invested in understanding what our policies are doing and also how we can make changes for the better. In 2015, I defended my dissertation, which was titled Diffusion of Shame, Experiences of Sex Offender Family Support Networks. And it was a really powerful moment for me because I had members of Nebraskans Unafraid and Fearless sitting at my defense and cheering me on, it was also interesting for my committee because they hadn't seen that kind of community involvement before. Once I graduated with my PhD, I moved to Texas. And then when I got here, I connected with Texas Voices. And over the last 10 years, I've tried to be a resource for Texas Voices as much as possible. I've met with Mary Sue with legislatures, and then I've also testified against some bills as they've come up in the Texas House. Research is a necessary component of my academic job, but doing research with organizations like Texas Voices and Nebraskans Unafraid, as well as NARSOL, research that has the power, if unfortunately not always the ability, to actually improve people's lives, that's something I really value. So I appreciate NARSOL inviting me to speak to you today, because I want to share with you some things that I've learned through my research that I hope will help you in your own advocacy. On this slide, I've put a QR code. Oh, I haven't shared the slides. That would be helpful. What is that? Goodness gracious. There we go. So on this slide, I have put a link, QR code here, and that links to my professional website. And there you can find my whole CV. You can also be linked to all of my research publications. I talked a little bit about research on Friday. I'm the research methods nerd in my department. So I talked about kind of how to access research, but I'll just share, if anybody ever wants copies of my research, please don't pay. I'm happy to send PDFs through email or send something out in the mail. So don't feel obligated. You can always find a way to get around the paywall. Okay, so I'm a teacher, so I had to start my presentation with some learning outcomes. My goal today is to equip you with some practical advocacy tactics that's drawn from research with people just like you. I want to share some insights from academic research, including my own work with NARSOL and the state affiliates over the years. And really what I've learned through my work is that most people begin this journey feeling very unprepared, right? They're motivated by personal impact, but a lot of advocates have to learn strategy the hard way through trial and error. And so today I want to kind of help shorten that learning curve for you if possible. So I want to talk through the legislative challenges that advocates in this realm typically face, and then also show you some strategies that have been used by advocates like yourself to open doors, to change perceptions, and overall to support positive policy reform. My goal is that you learn not how to fight harder, but how to advocate smarter using timing, positioning, and credibility to make sure that your efforts are effective at creating change for you and your loved ones. So I got to start at the beginning, and unfortunately, there's some negativity, but I'll get more positive, I promise. What does the world of advocacy look like for someone who's fighting for sexual offense policy reform? When someone steps into advocacy, it's easy to assume that if you just present lawmakers with logic and data, that change will follow, right? But unfortunately, overall, and particularly in this policy area, logic is not the dominant currency. Fear is. Sociologists call this a moral panic. And a moral panic is simply when a group in society, in this case, people with sexual offense convictions, are cast as a symbolic threat. And fear about that threat grows really, really rapidly. And the fear is completely often disconnected from actual risk or from data. It's just fear growing on fear. Now, here's the challenge. Once a moral panic takes hold, the laws that are being created stop being written to solve real problems and instead become performative responses, something that tells the broader public, like, hey, we know you're afraid and we're actually doing something. And we call this symbolic laws. And once laws become symbolic protections, rather than being actually designed to produce public safety, advocates like yourself are forced to work twice as hard just to get a fair hearing, because we're not really building bills based on public safety, we're building it based on that fear. And those are, disconnected things. Now, there's another challenge for you all, and this is something that as academics we've been exploring for the last 10, 15 years. When moral panics were first proposed in the academic literature, they were designed or they were defined as a temporary fear-based response. So the panic creates a surge in symbolic responses at a particular point, maybe because a high-profile event happens or something gets written up, and so that there becomes this temporary surge in panic. However, the way moral panics were designed is that the panic deflates over time. And so the policies can once again go from that symbolic response to more effectively focusing on solutions rather than just fear. Unfortunately, we've found, like my colleagues looking at this have found that with sexual offense policies specifically, they don't seem to follow that normal response curve. And so when they've looked at that, they found that for whatever reason, when it comes to sexual offense legislation, this panic has become not just a one-time reaction to a tragedy or a high-profile case, it's become a permanent background condition. And so that's shaped how lawmakers think about bills before the bills are even introduced. So if you've ever been talking to a lawmaker, you're spoken truth and data, and you still felt unheard, it's not because your argument wasn't strong. It's because you're speaking data and facts into a space that's dominated by fear and symbolism. And for you, advocacy then isn't just about having those facts. It's about learning how to use those facts to interrupt the panic-driven narrative and then also provide that strategic messaging. Now, given the fact that we're in a continuous moral panic about sexual offenses, researchers have tried to understand what facts lawmakers actually know about sexual offenses and sexual offense policy. One study that I looked at here interviewed state-level policymakers across all 50 states, and these were lawmakers who had actually sponsored sexual offense legislation in their districts. So if anyone's going to be knowledgeable, right, these would be the people. And the researchers found that the legislatures were very familiar with their state's sexual offense laws. And surprisingly, they were aware of the collateral harm that these laws have caused. In fact, almost all of the lawmakers interviewed, it was like 89%, acknowledged serious collateral consequences like homelessness, unemployment, family instability as a result of these policies. Now, part of their justification for this harm was inaccurate beliefs about recidivism and treatment. So lawmakers tended to overestimate the public safety risk of sexual recidivism. So there was lack of understanding of the data there. And they also expressed a lot of doubt about the effectiveness of treatment, particularly for high-risk individuals. So there's definitely some educational barriers there with lawmakers. But what was surprising when they looked at it, though, is that almost half of the lawmakers were actually pessimistic about their own law's abilities to fill their intended goal. So particularly in terms of increasing public safety. The evidence that the lawmakers did provide to the researchers showing that, hey, this law works, well, it was typically anecdotal. So it had been a constituent that came tell them about one specific situation, or it was testimonial evidence from CJ practitioners or agency reports. So again, they weren't getting a lot of real information about how these laws are performing. They were just kind of hearing stories and the story became the data. And also challenging is that when asked straight up, several lawmakers openly acknowledge that these laws are largely symbolic, meant to communicate a stance to their constituents rather than actually solving the problem. And in fact, one lawmaker was quoted as saying, "To be quite honest with you, we do these laws for the comfort of society. Society wants their legislatures to be tough on crime and tough on this and tough on that, but they especially want you to be tough on taboo things. So, part of it is on the books simply because society wants it to be there." So what does that mean for advocates, right? That means you're not walking into the room where lawmakers are completely ignorant. You're walking into the room where there is some knowledge, although there's also some misconceptions. But the biggest challenge is that, again, knowledge is not driving the decision making. And so that sets us up for this next reality that advocates have to face. And that is that, if lawmakers are aware of collateral harm, if they're at least somewhat aware of the reoffense rates, why aren't they acting on that knowledge? And the research points to one main reason, which is probably not a surprise, and that's political risk. In interviews with researchers, lawmakers indicated that opposing or even moderating bills that are framed around protecting children is seen as politically dangerous. In that environment, lawmakers believe that even appearing hesitant will be publicly weaponized against them. This is compounded by the perception that lawmakers who support sexual offense reform, as well as other criminal justice reforms, are being, quote unquote, soft on crime, right? And so the opponent can always say, oh, this person is exposing their community to more danger. So that's always a challenge, and that's a challenge with any CJ reform. But then you also have this increased challenge because of the moral panic relating to the sexual offense label. And again, you can see this reflected in the quote on this slide as well. So this legislator said, "I support strong sex offender laws because I believe it's the right thing to do. I have passed key sexual offender laws in my state, knowing full well that my constituency expects nothing less than me. I hope the laws are working and doing what they're supposed to, but I also believe they serve another purpose. They make the public feel like we're taking care of their concerns. And that is part of my job." So I think, to me, that says a lot, right? Like the lawmaker is literally saying, I'm hopeful. I hope they're doing what they're supposed to. But actually, like, they're also just to make somebody feel like we are taking care of their problems. And so that's a big challenge for an advocate. So when you walk into the room and you have strong data behind you, you have to remember lawmakers are not only evaluating whether or not your information is accurate, they're also evaluating whether aligning with that information feels safe for their own political future. And recognizing that and preparing for that is really critical for advocate strategy. So if lawmakers aren't primarily guided by logic and they're also afraid of taking politically risky positions, so the next logical question is, what can we do to change it, right? Does public opinion push them in the right direction? We've seen a lot of research arguing we should educate the public on the reality of sexual offenses. And I thought this was interesting. Again, a little depressing, but it's helpful to know. So Gillens and Page did a research study where they actually looked specifically at what is public opinion's impact on legislative policy. And they went really broad, which is why I think their findings are really interesting. So they looked at 1,800 policy outcomes, and they looked at testimonies and briefs and hearings and everything to try to figure out, okay, where was everybody at and what happened with this particular policy and when it went through the process. And what they found was that public opinion by itself had almost no independent impact on whether a policy succeeded, especially when it came from everyday people without an organized backing. In contrast, organized groups and economically influential actors, aka really rich people, donors, had a really strong effect on policy outcomes, even when their preferences conflicted with the general public. So what that tells us is that lawmakers don't simply follow the public will, right? They respond to an organized strategic pressure that feels politically legitimate and also feels persistent. And so for advocates, that's a critical insight because it shifts our focus from trying to change public opinion more broadly to becoming that organized, credible policy voice that lawmakers will take seriously. So I want to talk a little bit about who advocates for sexual offense reform. And when we look at advocacy in this space, most people don't start because they wanted to become policy actors. And I'm sure many of you are aware of that, right? You start in this space because something happens that you can no longer ignore. In my own research with Dr. Wooldridge, we heard the same pattern again and again. People didn't enter advocacy because they felt prepared to. They entered because personal impact pushed them into it. And another study that I'm going to pull a lot from is Aaron Cope-Martin. Both Aaron and I and Dr. Wooldridge, we all worked with NARSOL and state level affiliates. So we did a lot in this area looking specifically at the advocacy groups relating to sexual offense reform. And Aaron looked at that organizational level, and she confirmed what we had seen in our interviews. So most advocacy groups didn't begin with a formal structure or a formal budget. Instead, they started with a parent, a partner, a neighbor, someone responding to harm. And almost all of the individuals described the same emotional starting point, right? They were angry, they were grieving, they felt helpless. They weren't really thinking about legislation at that point. They just wanted to survive. They were trying to protect someone that they loved. Now, over time, that personal impact on them turns into political motivation. And that's the turning point we're talking about here. So the moment when someone says, if this is happening to us, it's going to happen to other people, and someone needs to speak about this. And that's the origin of true advocacy in this movement. It's not necessarily strategy first. It's usually impact first. And then the gradual realization that impact alone can't change policy unless it becomes an organized voice. And that's why you get organizations like NARSOL having these conferences and having these workshops to help create that strategic message and that group level organized voice, as opposed to individual people going to lawmakers and saying, this is a problem and I've been personally impacted. Now, there's two different ways that we talk about advocacy groups like NARSOL achieving policy change. And the first is what we call reactive advocacy. And this type of advocacy focuses on responding to bills that have been introduced already by lawmakers, either supporting the bills or, unfortunately for us, most often resisting them. This type of advocacy looks like showing up to the state capitol to block a harmful bill, testifying at hearings or committees about proposed changes. The goal with reactive advocacy is typically to prevent further damage. So, we're fighting the bills that expand the registry. We're fighting the enactment of residency restrictions. Things like we already know cause harm, and we're trying to stop them from being expanded in geographic area, in location, in number and scope, whatever that may be. And one of the challenges, particularly with this type of advocacy, is that because you're responding to bills that were introduced by lawmakers, usually that requires organizations to mobilize really quickly. And I know I'm on Texas Voices listserv, and during the legislative session, Mary Sue is constantly like, okay, we're checking the calendar today. We get an email when that bill comes out. It's like, okay, all hands on deck. We have 4 days, right? Because they're gonna have a hearing on this bill in 4 days. We got to go now. So that's that reactive advocacy, and it's important. But the second is proactive advocacy, and that is a longer, more sustained focus. And that proactive advocacy focuses on developing policy alternatives. It focuses on building credibility with lawmakers, preparing briefing language, even introducing reform bills. So instead of just opposing punitive ones, it's actually about potentially proactively creating bills that would potentially have the power to make positive changes. Proactive advocacy is more likely to emphasize building relationships with lawmakers across time, and proactive advocates will often partner with professionals and researchers to help craft and refine proposed legislation. This type of strategy is very useful not only for making proactive changes, but also for helping increase the legitimacy of the advocates in legislative spaces. Now, when Erin looked at sexual offense policy advocacy, when she looked at the group structure, she found that most groups begin reactively, but the ones that really gain ongoing influence and really continue in the legislative sphere are the ones that then shift into both reactive and proactive advocacy. So the groups become not about just responding to lawmakers, but also about trying to shape the agenda that lawmakers will actually see and go through. A lot of the research that I'm going to talk about today comes from research specific to sexual offense policy. I belong to an organization several years ago. Unfortunately, it's not current anymore, but we came together as scholars, and there was a bunch of us that were looking at this particular area of research. So there's a lot more research out there about the impact of sexual offense policy than you would expect. But we can also look at other social movements that will help us understand the best way to build influence at the legislative sessions. So McIndoe's research looked at nonprofit advocacy groups of all kinds, looking for common patterns, and studying how other advocacy organizations build influence can give us a playbook that advocates in this realm can adopt strategically for their own reform efforts. One of the most important findings from McIndoe was that the most influential advocacy groups didn't just show up during a crisis. They established ongoing relationships with lawmakers in those quiet moments way before a bill was actually introduced. Another key insight that McIndoe offered was that credibility isn't built in testimony. It's built in that proactive preparation. The advocates that arrived with solutions, not just objections, were taken much more seriously during bill negotiations than those who showed up simply to oppose what was being proposed. McIndoe also found that the most effective advocacy groups speak with what he called a dual language. So they used human stories to highlight the urgency of the reform, but they paired those stories with policy-ready language that lawmakers could lift directly into legislative drafts. And I'll talk more about this policy language as we go further. But when we connect McIndoe's findings to Comartin's findings about NARSOL specific advocates, a clear picture emerges. Reactive advocacy gets you into the room, but proactive advocacy keeps you there. And steady relationship building, what McIndoe called continuity, is what turns access into influence in the legislative session. So when you're actively in front of lawmakers, how do you message effectively to them? One of the strongest patterns in my research and those of my colleagues is that testimony that is purely emotional gets heard, but not acted on. So lawmakers may empathize, they may ask questions, they may, feel very real concern, but it doesn't necessarily translate easily into policy movement. Instead, lawmakers tend to engage more seriously when advocates speak in policy terms. You want to use the same language that lawmakers use in their own committee work. Things like compliance, enforcement strain, cost, housing instability, public safety outcomes, things like that. Advocates describe major turning points in their advocacy when they stopped telling their story just to be heard and they started telling it with the explicit purpose of illustrating a policy gap or a policy consequence and using that shared language. Research supports this idea by showing that advocacy groups gain credibility when they anchor a personal impact to a specific legislative consequence, like increased homelessness or ineffective supervision, rather than simply arguing, well, this law is unfair. So when you're crafting those messages for lawmakers, it's not about being less emotional. It's about pairing that emotion with the policy language. So the lawmakers can hear your pain, but they don't just hear pain. They hear pain and then they hear a legislative problem that they know how to act on. To message effectively, we also need to keep the audience in mind. We want to keep that in mind when we're messaging effectively. And so when we speak to lawmakers, again, the innate tendency is to go with that one track, and that's the personal story. This happened to me, and this is what happened. That story is powerful, and it is necessary, really. But on its own, it gets treated as testimony that's heard and not necessarily information to be used. And so, again, the goal is to pair your story with legislative logic to show not just that harm has occurred, but that the bill being considered will actually produce outcomes that the lawmakers don't want. And again, using that shared vocabulary, higher costs, lower compliance, instability that makes supervision harder, things like that. When we do that, when personal impact meets policy language, the message becomes actionable. Lawmakers can lift that phrasing directly from your discussion into a committee discussion, into an amendment language, into fiscal notes even. So that's the strategy you want to focus on. Heart plus policy, story, and the legislative logic. One gives you that moral legitimacy. The other one is going to give you that legislative traction. A big question, something I'm sure many of you have thought a lot about. When building your advocacy strategy, it's important to not only think about what you want to say, but also think about who delivers the message. Registered citizens bring the most direct lived experience, but we know from both policy interviews and lived accounts that lawmakers often discount their credibility immediately because they assume the speaker is motivated by personal interest. Family members are heard differently. They're often perceived as people that are they're less perceived as someone like trying to get out of something and more as similar to community members more broadly raising a concern. And so that can increase their persuasive weight in legislative conversations. Not unexpectedly, the research tells us another powerful voice comes from system actors like law enforcement officers, treatment providers, supervision officers, even sexual offense policy providers specifically. Now, research shows that lawmakers assign more legitimacy to voices already embedded in the state system, even when those people critique the current laws. I know that you may not have the support of CJ actors for every bill, but there are times when people within the system are just as concerned about the bill as people that are going to be affected by the system. So really looking for those times when you can connect with agencies or departments or treatment providers is really helpful. And finally, victims and survivors of sexual abuse are another powerful messenger. We often assume victims will just support punitive policies off the bat, but research shows something more complex. many victims actually express more nuanced perspectives. And in fact, a lot of victims are aware of the fact that the laws don't increase their own safety, and they may even hinder the stability and the compliance of the individuals that they're afraid of. So that, decreases their own feelings of public safety. So just like CJ actors, you may not have crime victims or a crime victim advocacy group that will be willing to partner with you on everything. But there may be certain laws or certain topics where you can get those support. And that's really powerful if you can gain that partnership. And of course, the best impact is when you combine all of these voices together, because each voice brings its own aspect. You have the lived experience of the registered citizens, you have that family member legitimacy, you have the system credibility of CJ actors, and you have that survivor nuance of victims. So when they combine together, they become a really powerful voice, and they can build a broader coalition that lawmakers take more seriously. So again, it may not happen every time, but there may be bills. I know here in Texas, we've had several where the CJ actors, I believe, Mary Sue has developed a good relationship with a lot of treatment providers in the area. And so we have several treatment providers that are willing to speak in legislative hearings on behalf of bills or against some of the bills that are proposed. And then there have been some victim rights groups that have spoken in partnership with us at times. Again, more limited, but you take advantage of every opportunity that you can get. Now, one of the most frustrating moments that advocates describe is when they go to speak about policy reform, and then the conversation shifts and the lawmaker starts asking, like, well, what exactly did you or did the person do, or what kind of offense was it, right? That shift is not necessarily accidental. It's a way that lawmakers can recenter the dialogue on individual blame rather than focusing on that system impact, because it becomes about that one person's crime rather than what's happening overall to everyone. And so if we follow that direction and we go down that path, you're going to end up defending a person instead of actually advancing a policy argument. That's also where emotions can start to run high too, and that's where you run into problems getting heard and getting really listened to as a serious contender. So in this situation, what did advocates say works best? Very simple. Acknowledge and pivot. Tell the lawmaker, hey, I'm not here to talk about the conviction, and then redirect back to that policy. That move does two things. It signals respect for the space because you're not sidestepping, you're not ignoring, you're acknowledging that exists, but you're keeping the focus on the policy consequence. And that's where lawmakers have to operate when they're writing or amending bills. So that's really where they need to be focusing anyway. This is a great quote from one of our interviews. This individual said, "Don't let them suck you into telling what your offense is. You've only got a few minutes, and now you've done your talk. And if they start asking questions, the thing to do is you have your comeback ready. You simply say, with all due respect, sir or ma'am, I'm here to talk about whatever bill," and pull out that next point. Again, remember, the goal is not to win a moral argument about the offense. At this point, we're not arguing guilty, not guilty, morally guilty, not morally guilty, whatever it is. The goal is to make it politically harder for them to ignore what is happening from the bill that they produce. So you want to really focus on that broader outcome and not the individual offense. Now, I thought this was something I wanted to pause, though, for a second before I go into some messaging strategies. Because honestly, everything we've covered so far, lawmakers ignoring data, families not being listened to, policies made out of fear instead of actual evidence, that warrants anger, right? So if you are an advocate in this area and you felt rage, if you felt exhausted or grief while you're doing this work, that's not a sign that you're too emotional or that you're not understanding it. It's a legitimate feeling. Anger is valid. Anger is also energy. And so it's not necessarily something you want to get rid of. It's something you want to aim. And so what I want to share over the next couple slides is some tools that are not about not being angry. They're not about just being polite or quiet. They're about learning how to weaponize that anger in a way that enters legislative rooms and actually stays there. So, and I'll hit this again, but anger starts that fire, but strategy is what continues the flame. So going back, again, I talked about reactive versus proactive advocacy, right? So reactive advocacy is reacting to bills that have already been proposed. And then proactive advocacy is about building that influence before legislation is written. Most of NARSOL groups deal with both types of advocacy. So today I wanted to give you some scripts or templates that will help you prepare, help you prepare for conversations with lawmakers under each of these conditions. On the reactive side, when a harmful bill drops or a sudden policy issue erupts, you need really fast messaging tools. Because again, you may only have a couple days before that hearing, and you may not have a lot of time to get everything together. And so one strategy I want to share with you is called the one sentence policy impact. And that helps you from being pulled into emotional testimony and make sure that you really focus on that policy relevance. And then, of course, keeping in mind that acknowledge and pivot redirect statement that I just discussed, that can help you from getting trapped in offense details instead of the policy substance. On the proactive side, I want to share some ideas for building those relationships with lawmakers. So the coffee shop opener that frames you as a resource instead of just a protest voice. And then once you build that relationship or create that relationship, sharing a template for a 1-minute legislative pitch, that becomes a respectful and structured way to offer a bill improvement or even an alternative bill that's easy for lawmakers to carry into committee language. And I want to share with you some ideas that other advocates say has helped them create and maintain relationships with lawmakers and their staff. Okay, so I know I keep talking to you about adding that human story to legislative concern, and that's really powerful when you have the time to testify in the bill. But it's also important to keep in mind that sometimes you might only have really short windows and you can still make an impact. So this one sentence policy impact is just a quick script that you have prepared, ready to go, so that you can run into the lawmaker in the hallway. You can meet their staffer in the office. You can talk to the lawmaker between testimonies when they're, pausing for a break. Something that allows you to deliver this important message in 30 seconds or less. And so because of the time, it stays away more from that personal story because it just focuses on, hey, I want you to know, here's what the bill will do, and here's how that translates into a specific cost, compliance, or safety, something that really resounds with them. So again, keeping in mind, lawmakers operate in terms of cost, enforcement strain, public safety optics. So when you translate that story into their language, they're much more likely to take it seriously. If you leave them with nothing else, you can leave them with one sentence they can repeat in their committee hearing. Because if your language enters their policy discussion, you've already shifted that narrative. So if you can give them words to mimic and to repeat, that's powerful advocacy, even if you're not physically in the room. So here's an example of this type of template. Let's say your state is trying to expand notification policies, expand the notification net. So you could say something like, this bill expands notification maps again, which means your sheriffs will spend more time managing public fear alerts instead of monitoring high-risk cases. And research shows that it does not improve actual safety. Notice how that one line still allowed me to get in a research shows reference, and it takes less than 30 seconds. And so that's perfect for a quick hallway comment or talking to a staffer and just saying, hey, I noticed that this is happening. Here's my concern with that. And there's another piece to this, and many of you, NARSOL is very strong with this, but I've seen this a lot with the state level advocates. But where you add the power is you have that 30-second line, and then you hand them something. So maybe you give them a 1-page research summary, or you give them a pamphlet about notification policy outcomes. That gives them language to repeat from your one sentence, as well as something to reference later. And that's going to, again, increase your longevity in the conversation beyond that brief 30 seconds in the hallway. Now, notice here what I didn't do in this sample text. I didn't argue about whether someone deserves to be on the map. I didn't get into a moral debate about the goal of notification policies themselves. Instead, I focused solely on policy function, on resource strain and false safety signals. And that's something that lawmakers should actually worry about. And so we put that into their language. That way, when we frame it, we move the conversation from that emotion, from the deserving, from the moral debate into the efficiency of your bill. And that type of shift is also easier for lawmakers to consider reform without necessarily feeling as political exposed, right? If they can grab onto those words and it's a budget justification, or it's a public fear justification, that helps them make reform efforts without being labeled as that, immediately soft on crime. Now, the next template, this isn't for a hearing, hence the coffee shop opener, right? It's not for a reactive moment either. This is for the proactive influence. So this is for those quieter times when nothing's actually on fire yet. You're just introducing yourself. The goal of the coffee shop opener is that you want to introduce yourself to the lawmaker and you want to frame yourself as a helpful resource and not an emotional opponent. So you're coming to them not to fight something, but as someone with knowledge that the lawmakers don't have access to on their own. The goal of the coffee shop opener is to plant that seed. So when this issue comes up, because we know it will, you can call me and I have some real world experience. Now, the challenge for everyone in this room is that, unfortunately, unlike other forms of advocacy, you don't have the luxury of being a neutral stakeholder. When you're a registered citizen or your loved one is a registered citizen, your identity or that identity enters the space before your message does. And so instead of avoiding that reality or getting pulled into a defensive posture, this template names that association plainly and then immediately shifts to your value and policy terms. So the full template's up here on the slide. So I've seen the sex offense registry or excuse me, I'm on the sex offense registry or my loved one is right here in your district. We've seen firsthand the impact of these types of policies. I know your office cares about public safety, and I'd be glad to share what we've learned really works if you ever review legislation in this area. Now, this format does 3 strategic things. First, it disarms suspicion. You have now named your connection calmly, and you've presented yourself as a source of field intelligence. You're not coming up to them angry. You're not coming up to them with a personal grievance. Some of the advocates I've talked to they talk about being met with a lot of surprise when they introduce themselves so outright. Because as we know, unfortunately, people expect the monster under the bed when you say the term sex offender. And so when they're able to meet someone who's rational, calm, intelligent, and stand in front of them and associate that person with the label of sex offender or sex offender loved one, it causes them to really think about, okay, well, what did I expect? And this is different than I expected, right? So you're just putting it right out there. I've talked to a lot of people. It's not an easy thing to do. Not everybody feels comfortable doing it, but it does really support some better relationships in the long term. Now, the goal of this template also, not only are you naming yourself, and I highlighted in your district, because that's also a big thing. If you can be in their district, they're going to pay a lot more attention to you if you're considered one of their constituents. But this template also positions you as a potential consultant. So you're introducing yourself as someone that the lawmaker can call on before the next hearing or the next drafting session to help them identify consequences that they don't see in fiscal notes. And this template also establishes a shared purpose. And I notice I've highlighted this. Your office cares about public safety. So you're not blaming them for policy harm. You're aligning yourself with their own stated goal, right? Yeah, you care about public safety. I care about public safety. And then you're offering them real world insight to help them achieve that goal. Without ever saying it directly, the message becomes like, we live with the outcomes of your policies every day, and we know things that your briefing packets don't show you. And so for lawmakers who genuinely care about public safety and efficient governance, that makes you an asset, not a disruption. And that makes you someone they can call on when they have questions further down the road. Now, this final template is your proactive pitch. And it's a great time if you make it to this part, because at this point, the lawmaker has now started to see you as a resource, and they've asked you some version of what would you suggest instead, right? Now, what the challenge for here is that instead of overwhelming the lawmaker with everything that's wrong with sexual offense policy, because we know there's a lot wrong, right? But we don't want to do that. We don't want to overwhelm them. We don't want to go in with like, okay, let's just throw out everything and start from scratch. You want to give them one clean thing that they can hold on to, and again, repeat to other lawmakers using that shared language. So having that prepared is key. This is one format you can do it. I mean, again, you don't have to get this formulaic, but this is kind of like walk you through what would you suggest. So I want to give you this legislative pitch, and it's a 4-part pitch. So it starts with the impact. Right now, with the way the policy is written, here's what we're seeing, right? You want to give short examples of real world consequences. Again, using those terms if you can: displacement, cost increase, compliance drop, impact on children, etc. 1, maybe 2 clear examples, not the full case, just needs to be pretty brief, but it should highlight what you see in your everyday life that lawmakers don't get to see firsthand. Then you go into the legislative impact. So we see that this is happening on the ground, and when that happens, it actually reduces compliance or it increases enforcement strain. And I know that's something your office pays attention to. Again, we're naming the consequence in their policy language, and we're making this that shared, hey, I know you're really trying to save money in our CJ system. So I want to talk to you about the cost of this. Then you want to offer a change that will improve the outcomes. So I think one change that would dramatically improve outcomes is blank. You want to make sure you're offering a direction, not a demand, right? So you have to be cautious about how you say this. You want to guide the lawmaker, not instruct them like you should absolutely make this change. Well, here's one thing I think will really help based on what I've seen. And then again, just like in the coffee shop opener, leave something behind. And it doesn't have to be a full legislative draft, although, over time, you might have this. Mary Sue's been working on a driver's license bill that all of Texas Voices has chimed in on. She's worked with treatment providers in the area. And so she literally, she has a draft ready to go. And so when one of the board members goes to meet with legislature, they can say, hey, are you interested in this bill? And it's laid out in legislative language. But it doesn't have to be that complete, right? It could be small things. It could be, here's a 1-page, a small adjustment, or this is what I think a better definition of the population that you're looking to capture in this, or a better timeline, right? So maybe, hey, if you're asking us to register within 3 days, here's the research on technical violations and how that 3 days can be really challenging, but maybe we can try to push it to 10 to 14. Because I found this research that says that it's not a public safety risk, things like that. That resource that you give them, delivered calmly, is often what can make it into that committee summary. Not because you won the argument, but because you gave them usable language, and that's how your influence is going to travel back into those committees. And lastly, something that cannot be overstated is the power of simply building relationships. And there's not a formal template for this part. Instead, I want you to think about something simple. How would you take care of a friend? Now, I'm not saying lawmakers need to become your close personal friends. That's not the goal. But in our research interviews, people told us that their biggest breakthroughs didn't happen in hearings. They happened in hallways, in quick office visits, over small personal gestures. The same relational practices that create and sustain friendships, those practices helped our advocates create and sustain influence. And what you see on this slide is suggestions of what works from advocates like yourself. Most importantly, familiarize yourself with the people. Learn staffer names. Understand who represents what district. Consider recognizing big life events. Drop a card off for the legislator's birthday. If the staffer is having a new baby, send a congratulations card. Even just remember what you talked about last time and follow up question. Hey, how did that trip go? Did you enjoy your time out of town? Whatever it is, the next time you see them. Those moments may seem small, but they're how you stop being a registrant or one of those people and you start becoming someone that they know, and that becomes somebody that they eventually trust, right? It's also really important to say this clearly. Staffers matter. Staffers are often the ones who decide whose email gets returned and whose policy language gets passed on to the legislator. So if a staffer likes you and trusts you, your influence is going to multiply, even over people who've never met you directly. Now, all of this is proactive advocacy. It's not just drafting bill language, right? It's being human in political spaces long enough so that when something comes up, you're on their mind and you think, and they're going to think, I remember I had a conversation with this person. I think I can call them to ask questions. That's the goal of building that relationship and continuing that relationship over time. I want to close off this presentation with some affirmation and also some encouragement. I feel like I started like all in the negative, so I have to make sure I leave on a positive space. So first, I just want to remind everyone that advocacy in this space does not come with formal permission. No one sends an invitation telling you, hey, guess what? You're now qualified to influence public policy. Legitimacy is not granted from the top down. It's claimed from the ground up through presence, consistency, and usable language. There will always be moments where you feel like an outsider in these policy rooms, and that feeling is real, but it's not a signal to leave. It's simply a signal that means you need to stay long enough that your perspective becomes part of the landscape. Not only do you have the right to be part of the policy change, you have the knowledge. Lawmakers only see policy on paper, in bill drafts, fiscal analyses. They live with numbers and charts. You live policy. What you experience every day in your own life is information about policy impact that the broader public does not have. And that means you carry a form of expertise that lawmakers cannot access without you. So when you speak, you are not just sharing your story. You are providing intelligence about the situations and personal impact their bills actually have in the real world. So don't downplay your own life experience. How you view the knowledge and the expertise that you have from living your life under these policies is going to affect how the lawmakers receive it. So be confident in that knowledge and that expertise. And finally, I want to go back to that image I told you, that flame concept. Anger is the spark to start movements, and it ignites because the harm was done, and that's powerful. But strategy is the steady hand, and that's what keeps the flame from burning out or burning down everything before it has an impact. But presence is really what transforms the anger. Advocacy isn't just one testimony or one bill fight. It's showing up often enough that your language starts to live in the room, even when you're not physically there. And that's how movements shift, not in one dramatic moment, but through steady human presence that lawmakers learn to recognize, then reference, and eventually rely on. Powerful advocates do not just resist harmful laws. They become the people that lawmakers turn to when trying to write better ones. All right. Well, thank you all for listening. And I truly hope you're leaving today with some strategies that you can use to go forward and to create real positive change in your communities.
Thank you very much, Danielle. That was an awesome send-off for us and wrap-up for the conference today. And we really appreciate your contributions that you've made to the organizations, both to Texas Voices and to NARSOL generally. And that was an outstanding presentation, and we appreciate it very much. And Nebraskans Unafraid. Thank you.